I wanted to talk for a few minutes about reading and analyzing a monograph. The assignment for the class, of course, is to read a monograph, to write a book review of it, and since this is an introductory class, I think it would be helpful to go over some of the basics of this, right? So I've put pictures here of different monographs that I assign in different classes. The Great Transformation is one that I do in my topics in ancient history, ancient world history course, medieval technology and social change I've done in the topics in medieval world history course. And then, these are more upper division kinds of things that I've assigned, right? It might be helpful to provide a definition of monograph, okay? A monograph is a book written on a narrow topic. Now, historians tend to write monographs, but the monographs appear in I think most academic disciplines, right? You could read a monograph on music, for instance, or on political science, or something like that. The point is, it's a narrow, focused study that tries to make an argument about something. In other words, it's not just a kind of summary of things, what we call a synthetic work, something like a textbook. A textbook is not a monograph. A monograph is a focused study that tries to make an original claim of some kind, okay? And so we have to evaluate monographs on that basis. We have to recognize, what they're doing. It's important to know something about the author. Right? If you want to evaluate something, well, don't just dive into the text. Learn a little bit about the author. Find out what the author's authority is. And by that I mean, why is this person qualified to write a study like this? And you might find that, their qualifications are somewhat suspect. But chances are if they're writing a monograph, they have some background, some experience, some training, some education in the topic at hand, right? They have a PhD, or they have experience, working with this. Maybe they've written other books on the same or similar topics. And books often fit within, say, a career trajectory for an author. They may be fascinated with something, and then that, led them into a different study, and that led to this monograph in question, or whatever, right? So take a little time at least and learn something about the author. If you discover that the author really doesn't seem to have the credentials to write something like this, well, that may be helpful, to determine whether you should read it or not, or to critique it if you have to read it for an assignment or something, okay? Now, into the nuts and bolts of monographs. When you're reading a monograph, you should try to identify the following things. First, the thesis. What is the author's argument? What claims are they making that try to contribute in some way to knowledge generally? Often monographs are usually written as part of a conversation with other scholars. It's rare you find, a wholly new topic. There's usually some original take on an existing topic, right? So what is the author trying to say? And to do this, you may need to understand, in history at least, some of the historiography. By that we mean, the patterns of interpretation that have existed among historians. What have historians said about this topic? How have those interpretations shifted? How are these in conversation with each other? Who is arguing against whom, or for whom, or with whom, or trying to extend the conversation in one direction that may not have been treated before, right? Theses are, they operate within that kind of conversational space. So it's helpful to understand that. But try to identify the thesis. If you can even, sometimes the authors will say very helpfully, like, my argument is, or in this book I assert, or, something like that, right? I recommend that students do similar things, to say this paper will contend that or argue that or whatever, right? So, but I mean, in some cases, authors try to be cagey about this, and they don't necessarily want to state their exact argument, right? So you have to extrapolate from things. Try, if you can, to summarize the thesis of an author. Okay, one of the things that you should do in a book review, in fact, is to identify the thesis and try to put the thesis in your own words, or especially if the author, himself or herself, does not provide a direct quotation to say what the thesis is. You, of course, need to critique the thesis too. Is this an effective argument? Why is it effective? Why is it not effective? And what kind of contribution is this making? Is this truly original? Is it helpful? Whatever. Next point, methodology. Okay. How does the author go about making this argument? In history, methodology involves the use of sources. What primary sources is the author using? And maybe more importantly, how is the author using these primary sources? It's one thing and often students will say, this author, she uses these primary sources, these journals or these economic records or whatever it is, but my follow-up question is always, how does she, the author in this case, use them? What does she have to say about them? How does she analyze them? Is there a school of thought that she's adopting or drawing from in providing this interpretation? So you need to go beyond just saying, like, these are the sources. You need to talk about how the author uses the sources. That should be an important part of your critique. Bias is obviously a related point to all of these things, right? Bias is not inherently a bad thing. Well, I think we could say that some biases, things like racism, sexism, and so forth and so on, right, are probably negative biases. But a bias is simply the subjective viewpoint that the author has, right? And often bias is related to the conversation that the author is having or trying to enter into with other scholars who may have worked on similar things. And bias can be detected, or things that can influence an author are, the author's training. Where and with whom did this author study? What other things has this author written? How does this author relate to other scholars who work in this field? Is there an obvious contention against another author, another author's argument, right? And that can provide the bias. In some cases, you may identify an author as, say, a postmodernist or a Marxist or something like that, right? And that's the obvious bias there. One's nationality, one's religion, one's race, any of these things can kind of inflect an interpretation in some way. And so, don't assume that an American writing about European history is biased inherently or something, right? Try to detect how that bias plays out. And this can be an important, component that you'd want to critique in a book review. Those are the three most important in my mind, three most important components. But you should also be aware of the audience of a book, right? In critiquing a book, you got to know which audience the author is targeting. If the author is trying to write to a general audience, not just an audience of their peers who work in the same field, then you would critique it one way versus a kind of inside conversation going on between scholars. How do you tell? Well, part of it is the tone and maybe the use of jargon or language that is typical or kind of inside baseball, as my doctoral advisor used to say, within the field itself. But you can also tell or get some clue by looking at the press who publishes it. If it's a university press, you can maybe, assume that this is written more for a kind of educated audience of those who are interested in this field or may work in that field. If it's published by a trade, that's not always the case. Sometimes university presses publish things for general audiences. Some of them almost specialize in this, like Oxford University Press publishes a lot of stuff that's meant for general audiences, for instance. But if it's a more specialized press, right, then you can assume that this may be written for a smaller audience. Whereas a trade press, something like Penguin or Signet or Doubleday or Knopf or one of these big presses, HarperCollins or whatever, right? These are written for a more general audience. These are the kinds of works that you may find in, say, an airport bookshop or a Barnes and Noble or something like that, right? Where it's not just specialists, and you'd want to critique them differently. I mean, if the author is writing for a general audience, well, you want to say, does this reach a general audience? Is this conversation too elevated or too filled with specialized terms or something like that for a general audience, right? The writing style is an important component. This is like low-hanging fruit. Students are very ready to critique the writing style, to say, this was readable or this put me to sleep or something. Don't go there in a book review immediately, please. Deal with the thesis, deal with the methodology, deal with the bias. If writing style is an important component of this that ought to be critiqued, then by all means do that, but don't lead with that and don't make that your main point in writing when you write a book review. I want to say something about reading techniques, okay? Students of history and students in other disciplines that are very reading intensive need to learn how to read things quickly. So how do you do this? Well, I mean, reading the introduction first and maybe the conclusion immediately thereafter, if there is one, would be a good start to this, right? Once you've read the introduction and conclusion, have some sense of what the book is about, what its argument is and such, then, you may know, okay, I really need to read this part of the book, right? This chapter seems particularly important. It might be helpful to read some book reviews of a monograph, okay? So go on to a database like JSTOR or something and find some other scholars who have reviewed these books. Now, you obviously shouldn't copy what the reviewers have said, and you should never read only one book review. My suggestion would be read at least 3 book reviews to give you a sense of, different opinions about this book, different takes on its importance and such. And then, use the introduction, use the conclusion to then determine what else you need to read in the book. It may be that you've gotten enough out of it at that point. But there's always the technique of reading the first sentence of every paragraph, or reading kind of the introductory parts of chapters and the concluding parts of chapters to get a sense of it, and kind of skimming the rest, right? You don't have to read absolutely every word to absorb a book. If you have time, by all means, and if it's something you really enjoy, then read every word. But practically speaking, it's difficult to do this with the volume of reading that you tend to be assigned in history classes. Finally, let me say this about book reviews. A book review should contain, I think, 2 main parts. One is the summary of the book, but don't make the summary I often read book reviews that are like 90% summary, where it's just like, here's what the book says. Let me, say you have a book review that's 1,000 words, about 3 to 4 pages of typical, writing. Well, I'm going to spend 3 pages writing a summary of this, and then a one paragraph where I say, yeah, this book was good, it read really well, I like the author's argument, or something like that, right? That's not sufficient for a book review. My suggestion would be try to summarize, make the summary maybe a third to no more than a half of the paper, less if you can, and then your analysis, your critique of the thesis, the methodology, the bias, and then other things like audience and writing style. That should be the most important part, and perhaps even the majority of the book review, right? So if you have questions about that, feel free to bring them up and to ask me personally, or bring them up in discussion boards or whatever. Thanks.